Brief statement, and I'm really looking forward to this very rich conversation. Thank you again for this invitation. And I think this idea of internationalism is so important to what we need to do next. And so I'm especially thrilled to be here. And so my name is Dindy Kitunga. I'm an organizer and educator based in Los Angeles. I am an immigrant to the US from Kenya. And so I have that perspective as well. And so I do want to begin by uplifting specifically Black and Indigenous folks of color, women of color, and working class folks, because any wins that we have had really have come from those folks. Okay. And so each generation of revolutionaries must theorize and act based on current conditions. And so movements like Black Lives Matter have not been only at the forefront of just fighting for police violence or against the incarceration of Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks or unjust immigration systems, but we've also taken on issues like social issues like mental health, LGBTQ rights, reproductive justice rights for folks of color. Moreover, the current COVID-19 crisis has not revealed a we're in this together moment, as many in the bourgeoisie were claiming that it would. In fact, this particular crisis, as all of you know, has laid bare all of the inequities we have in our societies and definitely across the world. And we're certainly seeing that with the rollout of the vaccine currently. And so indeed, the social and economic impacts of this crisis, coupled with the racist murders of Black folks, and also this idea that certain people in our society are kind of relegated to death, right? Certain people are vulnerable to death, is what has fueled the resistance and the revolts that we see. And you know, as much as I'm here to talk about Black Lives Matter, I think of it as a movement that is, you know, multiracial, multifaceted, really very working class, involves sexual minorities, and that the people who are really rising up against the domination of racialized and gendered capital are those who are leading this particular struggle. And so the 2020 elections in the US, we did get a couple of wins. We did get a couple of electoral wins, and I don't want to undermine those, and I thought that I would list some of these. We have managed to, in fact, defund the police somewhat. Here in Los Angeles, we've managed to pull resources from police departments and be able to maybe pour them more into social programs. The LAPD, I think to date, is still the most murderous of all police departments in the US. And so now we currently have replaced our district attorney, and the district attorney who we have is very much on notice and understands that he works for us and that he will be replaced and will need to have another job unless he really does what the movement needs it, you know, for him to do. And so we're seeing investigations into police unions, things that we really haven't seen before. There's also a great critique of not just policing, but the carceral state. So courts, the surveillance state, child welfare services. There's a lot of discussion about curriculum and schooling. And, you know, believe it or not, this crisis has somehow expanded the welfare state, which is a really interesting thing to say, because the US is a society, as you probably all know, where we don't have things that folks in the global north have, such as, you know, universal healthcare. Those discussions are now almost mainstream, and there's a great appetite for them. And so it's a matter of how can we organize towards some of these goals. We did suffer a couple of losses with this past election, and I do want to highlight one in Los Angeles that has, California, that has great implications for the entirety of the US and perhaps the global context. There's a Prop 22 that managed to pass, and essentially what it is, it prevents gig workers from I'll try and make it very quick. It reclassifies gig workers so that they are not able to organize, unionize, get benefits. And again, I'm generalizing. But big tech did in fact spend $205 million for this, and this has been a loss for us. And so Instacart and other grocery companies are already laying off people, and so that's something we're struggling against. Something else that we're struggling against, a failure that we had here on the West Coast, had to do with affirmative action, and we consider that to do with perhaps politics of resentment, because generally those who have benefited from affirmative action have been poor, working class and middle class white women. And so that's something else that has been a little bit of a loss for us. And so beyond organizing in horizontal democratic collectives, because that's, I think, what we're mostly seeing, we're seeing demands for abolition, and abolition has started to mean all sorts of things. And in many ways, part of our movements, what we're doing is trying to make sure that our notions of liberation and abolition are not captured by the state, are not captured by liberals, or are only kind of have the kind of only surface reforms. And here I want to highlight the importance of mutual aid work, and why this is probably something we're going to see is important, at least for the foreseeable future. And so I think of mutual aid in the same way that Ruth Gilmore does, which is mutual aid is survival pending revolution. And so mutual aid addresses community survival needs, but it also serves another important purpose that I think is important for the left, which it undermines the reification of human relations under capitalism. And so mutual aid care work in particular necessarily reveals how things like reproductive labor, mostly done by working class women of color, sustains capitalism, especially in women-led movements like BLM. And so as the capitalist mode of production reproduces this capitalist worker relation, and capital subsumes everything we do in our lives, and even the structures that reproduce it, such as, the patriarchal nuclear family and other institutions of care, we see that these things begin to degrade. And certainly we can see that the mutual aid work that we're doing needs to kind of fill the gap between, kind of what the state can or is willing to do and what private corporations are willing to do. And so I think of mutual aid as not just survival, but a way for us to practice and maybe think about what different and new societies we can have as we establish kind of new ways of being through our mutual aid work. I'll move on fairly quickly, and I'm hoping other panelists will address this, which is the right-wing white nationalist movements that we're seeing. Most of us were shocked to see what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. I would not say that we were surprised. Certainly Black Lives Matter, starting from 2013, we have been categorized as terrorists and enemies of the state for simply demanding for the state not to kill us and for demanding to be recognized as human. And so we were not surprised. And in fact, there's quite a lot of anti-fascist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist organizing around this question of right-wing nationalism. And I think we're going to see the Biden administration begin to take it a little bit more seriously, because what happened is the violence turned inwards, right? All of the violence that is exported outwards, like, it was on full display for the world. And so that definitely makes the state nervous. One thing that we're trying to do in our movements is to really think about this language of terrorism, and also think about some of the solutions that the states will propose. And so we're very careful in thinking about, will the surveillance state be expanded if if the language of terror is kind of weaponized against anyone and everyone, right? will we see a second kind of Patriot Act, one that will definitely disproportionately affect Black and brown folks of color. And I think what we're seriously refusing and rejecting is that our left-wing organizing and mobilizing is the same as the radicalization of the right-wingers, which is something that we're seeing coming out of kind of neoliberal conversations. And so what we're kind of forcefully saying is that, you know, the right wing, these are politics of resentment and disappointment and death and domination. And we're actually fully embracing life. And these are in fact not the same. And so how we deal with these problems, I think, is really interesting. And I'll stop there because of time, but I am very curious as to what to the conversation that's going to come out of this. And so we are, of course, very leery of neoliberal capture and the lackluster proposals of the Biden administration. But I do want to be clear that I think our number one enemy is, in fact, fascist creep and right-wing authoritarianism, and that's like really what needs to be confronted quite heavily. And then that our critique really should be the ways in which neoliberalism can in fact facilitate a lot of this kind of right-wing authoritarian violence that we see. And you can stop me at any time, but I do have one final point to make on what I'm going to call emancipatory internationalism. And so what I'm arguing for is that we need to collectively build on our radical internationalism, and that we need to very much look, and I'm talking about myself and folks who I organize with, to folks in the global South, and move our politics out, like decenter our politics from the global North and really look there for some of our solutions. In a recent piece that I've seen that has really kind of teased this out, they really, the ideas here were really to not just extend this idea of internationalism or solidarity or anti-imperialism to non-Western authoritarianism, but to really look at the ways in which some of the states that we reside in, some of the ways in which even our left-wing or organizing facilitates some of these things. And so I'll kind of end with this idea of what are we to do and what happens should we get what we want, which is a complete liberation of our people. And so I'm really saying who better to look to than those who have historically at every turn rejected dehumanization and whose demands have never been quenched with bourgeois recognition or reforms. And so at this particular time, Black, Indigenous folks of color, queer folks, and youth revolutionaries, I think, are the people who we need to set our sights to and at. And if these are the people who are building a new day, I think that this new day can only be built on not just the robust radical traditions and the theorizing and the work that has come before us, but also from really the continuous work and principled hope that we all hold, and also really like looking towards how our practices are informing the kind of theory that we need to produce. And I think the last couple of months have almost been leaps and bounds. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dindy. And yes, let's hope really that the last few months have seen big strides. I'm gonna jump to Paul now, but there's so many questions coming just from the brief introduction that you did, and I've posted Dindy's article in the chat, and feel free to post any of your writings or anyone who wants to share or respond to that. Over to you, Paul.
Okay. Well, thanks, Elena. You know, I read Ndindy's article for the first time this morning, and I was very excited by it. And I'm even more excited after hearing her talk, because, you know, I'm basically going to be a footnote to what she said. I mean, she raised so many rich issues that which I fully agree. I'll just start with I visited Kenya 3 times in my work as an international labor organizer, working with hotel workers and the food workers there. And it was an amazing experience in all cases. But I got a little saddened because it seemed like each time I went back, the city had more desperate people selling apples on the street, and it was just a kind of a terrible situation that very brave people were fighting against. And the people that I was working with were basically revolutionaries who were taking jobs in the hotel industry to make a living. And it was really moving for me. My background is international labor solidarity activist, and I spent 20 years traveling the world and had the privilege to work in about 40 countries on behalf of the International Union of Food Workers. That included the UK, by the way, and visiting the UK many times for the TGW school in Eastbourne or the GMB school in Manchester, and lots of good pub drinking. So, I mean, my life has been really rich. And at 80, I feel so privileged to have had the opportunity to have people pay me to do what I would have wanted to do anyway. But Dindy just reminds me, congratulations on the victory on the partial defunding of police. And I feel deeply the loss of the gig driver, the Uber and Lyft driver issue. It's very bad for the future because that's the growing sector of our economy. And DSA is very active in trying to get a foothold in that area. Just a word about DSA. At 80, I can't really claim to represent the mainstream of DSA. They're mainly about 25 now, and there are a lot more of them. And I try to work with them and on various projects, especially the International Committee. I don't claim to speak for that tendency, but I really feel proud of being part of that movement. Todd Chrétien, who spoke at another Europe is Possible conference last month, I think you're going to put a link to the podcast there. Todd really laid out much more about DSA, so I won't say anything more about it, except to say how happy I am that the 2 latest faces that are the public face of DSA are Cori Bush, a nurse, an African-American nurse from St. Louis, and Jamal Bowman, an African-American educator from New York City. It's so nice not to be so much of a white Bernie bro and to actually be part of a living movement that's going to be led by people of color in the future. Okay, enough of the prelims. Now let's get to the right wing. And I didn't think a few thousand Proud Boys in Washington was going to make a big difference. I kind of downplayed that. I was surprised, they say surprised, but not particularly shocked by what happened. Let me try to analyze that a little bit. And I just want to, I'm just going to have like 3 aerial views. Here's an aerial view of the right. Look at the footage of the US Capitol attempted coup and takeover. Look at the flags. If you look at the flags there, you will see what are the various tendencies and threads of the radical right. There's the yellow flag that shows a coiled rattlesnake and says, "Don't tread on me." That's sometimes called the Gadsden flag, if you want to know a reference to it. That was the symbol of the Tea Party, as well as the symbol of various right-wing populist groups in the American West. The Confederate flag, of course, symbolizes white supremacy and the long struggle to first stop slaves from being emancipated, and second, to keep them from voting. And of course, this is very present and very strong, not only in the radical right, but in the Republican Party. You had anti-abortion and evangelical Protestant things about Jesus. Deluded people from that area joining this movement, thinking it's somehow Christian, which is hard to understand. And finally, you had the MAGA hats and the Trump flags. Now, what that says to me is that Trump nationalized this, what had been a relatively fringe movement. He gave it legitimacy and he emboldened it. He became its standard bearer. But do not think that if the great orange man disappears, that that movement is gone. That's not the case. It's very possible that it'll come back rearmed and ready to shoot in 2022 if the Democrats fail to bring in any fundamental reforms to, or any fundamental answers to the enormous crises now racking the United States. So that's just a kind of a, it became Trump's personal cult following, but Trump's personal cult following is bigger than these radical right-wing groups. Scary statistics. Just a week ago, polls showed that 80% of all Republicans thought that Biden stole the election and Trump had really won. That is a scary base. They also believe that 80% of them believe that Biden is a socialist, which is unfortunately not the case. But this will be a very hard block to pick apart. It is beginning to self-destruct a little bit. And we have to draw the right lessons from that. Trump is now desperately looking for a way to get back into power. And he has been floating the idea of a third party, a patriot party, made up mainly of these right-wing militias, but also of the millions and millions of people who voted for him. 74 million people voted for Trump. The majority of white people in America voted for Trump. This is a scary statistic. It's one that's not going to go away. And we have to think about that. It has a lot to do for left strategy too. And I'll try to play that out. Okay, that's one picture. Now let's take another snapshot, the center, but I'm calling the center just for convenience. Look at the Biden inauguration. Now, look, we all had a tear in our eyes. I mean, the great orange balloon has floated away. We have what looks again like an America reasserting itself, a multiracial, more just, more diverse, younger people. Just normalcy feels so good. But I remember this before. I felt that way in 2009 when Obama was inaugurated. It had pretty much the same symbolism. In fact, the 2021 inauguration was almost a replay of the Obama inauguration. There were some wonderful things about it. I love the poetry and I love the images. I love the fact they put working people first, or ordinary people. There were a few things I didn't like, but it's more the absence. The workers were not shown as unionized. They were not shown acting collaboratively. Jennifer Lopez sang "This Land Is Your Land." I love that, but she only sang the chorus, not the words, the trenchant words that showed the anger of workers in 1940. And so it's okay. I mean, my heart leapt too. So I'm not going to put it down. It's an absolutely essential part of what we're doing. So think about the different symbolism. The American flag was more inclusive. It was the symbol of a different America, a part of America which has always been there, although sometimes eclipsed. The city on the hill, the place where immigrants could come and find freedom and all that. It's all real. The problem is, how do we make it real? And we're not going to make it real by playing cuddly games with Republicans, even those that have rejected Trump. They'll go part of the way, but they're not going to be interested in addressing the fundamental and growing inequalities, the racist policing, the mass incarceration. We can make some gestures in that direction, but there's not going to be any fundamental change unless the left organizes very effectively to push it at all levels, not just national, but as Dindy pointed out very well, at state and local levels. I mean, we have that possibility. There is an America there which is not the ugly face that we've seen for the past several years. We've been divided for generations, basically not so much on class lines, but on lines of, do we want to include people or do we want to exclude people? And that's really what it's about. Do we include all people, including and all people of the world, and have a genuine openness to it? Or are we Fortress America, made up mainly of aging white men? I have a lot of hope that the new generation is different. My sense of the millennial generation is that it's much more multiracial, and even the white members of it are much more conscious of fighting the need to fight racism. But it's a scramble. Let's talk about the climate just for 1 second. One thing I've spent a lot of my life on, and I'm the chair of the DSA's International Eco-Socialist Committee. It's a race. I mean, we have to do so much in so little time. We've just blundered away 5 years. Now, Biden can do some good things by reversing some of Trump's executive orders, and he's already begun to do that. That's very promising. And frankly, I think the Sunrise Movement is one of the greatest things to come along in the United States. It's like Occupy, except they're doing things, not just sitting in camps. I mean, that's the difference. It's a weaponized Occupy movement, and I'm so happy with the young people, some of them very young, that I've been working with on climate issues. I think it's revitalized all of us, and as I say, at 80, I feel more hope right now than I felt for a long time, despite the terrible crisis we're in. And I'd also say, and just I can't elaborate on it, the Black Lives Matter protests, which were the longest and most sustained protests in American history. Very, very consistent, persistent, impressive. People just kept coming back, despite police violence, despite all the things they were being called. I was so happy that some of the people were white. I'm also happy that it was led by African American and people of color. I mean, it is what gave us hope. And if you look at the Georgia runoff elections, which you probably all heard about, I won't belabor that. I didn't know that was going to happen. I thought maybe one of them would win if we were lucky. Why in fact did a young Jewish man from Georgia and the pastor of Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, why did they win their Senate races? It wasn't because they were on the left. They're not particularly on the left. But nonetheless, they do represent a different America, right? And their victory makes it just possible to get some legislation through the next Congress. It looked as if only executive orders from Biden and better appointments could come out of it. Now there is at least a small chance for actually some sweeping legislation. And for that to happen, that requires the left. Now, some of my young comrades in DSA think that requires people being angry in the streets and criticizing Biden. My suspicion is that for at least half a year, the left and the center will have to move in the same direction, because Biden cannot be true to his old self, which was a neoliberal Democrat who collaborated with Bill Clinton in the 90s on a lot of anti-Black legislation, basically, and the whole thing about mass incarceration and aggressive policing, which was as much a Democratic program as a Republican program. There also has been a long history of Democrats, despite their rhetoric, being almost as bad on immigrants and hostile to immigration as Republicans are. Will that change? Well, I was encouraged that Biden's first announcement of his first major legislative push was for immigration reform. I think it's signal, and the fact that some of his executive orders were to reverse some of Trump's most hateful actions against immigrants. That's encouraging. I don't know what's going to pass, but I think the left should follow Bernie Sanders and the members of the squad, because I've been reading what they're saying now, and frankly, they're doing it very well, much better than DSA's official statements. Members of the squad are all sending the same message. We have the opportunity, we have a window of opportunity to move things in the next year or two. If we don't do it, and Sanders makes that very clear. Sanders, exact quote from Sanders, he said, "I have absolutely no doubt that if we do not deliver for working people now, that there will be a fascist reaction in 2022 that will end that window of opportunity, close that window of opportunity." And Bernie, I'm sorry he didn't get to be president, but he's in a good place. He is because of the victories in Georgia, he will be chair of the Senate Budget Committee, with a lot of power to get things through by something called budget reconciliation, which does not require the 60 votes that some people think is necessary in the Senate, but it requires just a majority to get through sweeping legislation that involve budgetary issues. And all of the major issues we face are also budgetary issues. Recovery from the pandemic requires an enormous commitment to public health. Whether it's called Medicare for all or not, it's not so important, but it requires an enormous extension of both healthcare and the ability to pay for it to the entire American people. The climate requires absolute commitment to a jobs program to rebuild the infrastructure and to set the economy back on track toward climate resilience. But at the same time, creating a lot of jobs for some of the people that voted for Trump in refitting houses and buildings and so forth. Sanders understands that. The squad understands that. Probably the center of the Democratic Party understands it, but will they fight for it? We will see. It's really up to us. So I just want to close. Maybe I only said a tenth of what I wanted to say, but I do want to say. I could quote the poet, our wonderful new poet. She was absolutely amazing, and probably I need to quote. Well, you can read it. Amanda was fantastic. Amanda Gorman at 22 years old was one of the wisest people I've ever heard. She put that together. She wrote those verses under the pressure right up to the Capitol riot, and I think she concluded it that day. And it is such a powerful statement from that young generation. But I want to say there is a little bit of hope that Biden might not be another Obama. And not as much as I love Obama, but he was not a good president. He was a great candidate, but not a very good president. But Biden, to get over his stutter, memorizes poetry and recites it. And one of the best lines that he used in his inaugural address was actually one of my favorite poems by Seamus Heaney. And it goes something like, "History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme." Well, I have that hope, and I think, and Dindy closed with that hope. Can hope and history rhyme? After all our struggles over many generations before me and for my 80 years, once they rhyme and at least we get back on the right track and at least start addressing some of these problems together, that's really the task of the Democratic Socialist left, is to be the glue that holds that together and helps create. I didn't say much about the world, but I totally agree with Ndindi about that. If it isn't a global vision, and that's what I spent most of my life doing, it's not going to happen. It has to happen for everyone. And I'm proud to see Bernie Sanders put right on his list of important things is not to have vaccine apartheid, to make sure that vaccines get to the people that really need them. And I'll just close with that on a note of hope, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the speakers.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much. I really appreciate the kind of the coherent way in which you ended your contribution with the poetry, but there are a lot of questions that are coming through, so you will get the chance to speak again if you have other poetry lines. Prepare a few. We're now going to hear from Nick. Nick is going to talk, I think, mostly about the trade deal, but it would actually be good if you can say a couple of things, especially on what both of our speakers mentioned, and that is, how can we ensure an equitable distribution of the vaccine, actually, and an equitable handling of the pandemic, something that I know Global Justice Now works on quite a lot.
Thanks very much, Alina. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be really quite short this evening. First of all, I just want to say a huge congratulations and well done to Ndindi, to Paul, to all of the US comrades who fought so hard against this awful, awful president and got rid of him. We, Shyster, Alina, and myself, amongst many activists in the UK, set up the Stop Trump Coalition 4 years ago. We wanted to offer what small solidarity we could, and I hope that some of the pictures of demonstrations reached you. I'm sure that the baby Trump balloon did, and I hope that upset him greatly. But the fight was yours. The fight and the struggle was yours. So thank you for not giving up and getting us to this point. Of course, as Paul's just said, where we are now, a nicer man in the White House is not sufficient. We need something far more radical than that. And of course, it's going to be primarily the grassroots activists in the US that are going to have to make that happen. There are so many aspects of our global economy at the moment that are driving us towards the far right and Trumpian type politics. Trump didn't come from nowhere. Of course, he came from decades and centuries of racial injustice in the United States, but also the very nature of our global economy at the moment, which is dominated by big capital and big corporations rolling roughshod over everybody, fueling some of the worst inequality we've ever seen. And frankly, at this point, it is incompatible with our democracy. And so either we need to do something very, very serious to radically restructure this, or, as you've already said, in 4 years' time, we're going to be in potentially an even worse place than we were 4 years ago. So there is everything to play for, but the stakes are incredibly, incredibly high. And it's not just, obviously, it's not just in the United States. We have our own, well, we know that Trump called our own Prime Minister Britain's Trump. They certainly share not just the same haircut, but many other awful aspects of the deregulatory push that they want to unleash. I mean, they stand for capital in their own populist way, and much of Johnson's program, I think, mimics in a slightly softer way, maybe, what Trump has done. And the same things across Europe, and the same things in India, in Brazil, and so many other parts of the world. So I really hope, I'm really excited to be part of this. I hope we can continue to learn from each other and work with each other in the coming years, because we're really going to need to, if we're going to get anywhere and change the world in the way that we all know we need to. Look, I'm just going to say a little bit about the US trade deal. I know most people on the call probably know a bit about it already. For Boris Johnson and his cronies in the Vote Leave campaign who brought us Brexit, that their aim was to fundamentally change this country, was to break us away from the standards, protections, and rights that we've campaigned for and worked for decades, and to create a kind of rupture, a kind of shock, which will allow them to, I mean, in their words, kind of unleash this British entrepreneurial spirit, or whatever other nonsense they come up with. But really, this is about leaving us even more vulnerable and exposed to the powers of the market and the power of capital. And an absolute centerpiece for them of this project is a trade deal with the United States. Now, Trump also wanted that deal, not because it was particularly beneficial directly to him, but because he saw weakening the European Union as a great thing, because he saw it as a big competitor to the United States. So the European Union and China were the two big bogeymen for Trump. And if he could pull Britain away from the European Union and into the US orbit, that was all good for him. We know very well that Biden is not quite as keen on this project. We know very well that he probably hasn't got much time for Johnson and doesn't like him very much. But we've also got to remember, of course, that he is not only being pushed by some of the wonderful activists like we have on our call this evening, but by the same big business interests that in many ways push Trump on, you know, big agriculture, big pharmaceutical corporations, big tech, you know, they are going to be pushing incredibly hard. And the stuff that we were most worried about in the US deal is precisely the demands of those industrial sectors. Hopefully, goes without saying, there's nothing anti-American about our campaign to stop the US-UK trade deal. This is really about stopping this project of Boris Johnson's to turn this country over ever more to international capital, to deregulate our food standards, to undermine the rights and protections that we have left, our public services like the NHS, which we you know, are so dependent upon at the moment. This is all wrapped up in Johnson's project to get this US trade deal. And of course, he looks over to the US as a kind of dream society, really, where the market really does hold more sway even than it does here, and that's what he wants, right? So this is a perfect way of cementing that into place, and we've got to stop it. And by stopping it, of course, it's not the only thing we've got to do, but I do think that we can stop it, actually, because I think that many people who were lied to about the reasons for voting Brexit don't really want anything to do with this kind of free market agenda of Boris Johnson, and can easily be convinced to join us in opposing this awful trade deal. So I think we can stop it. And by stopping it, I think we can throw a major spanner in the works of this right-wing Brexit project, and from there can actually begin to redefine who we are as a country and the role that this country plays in the rest of the world. And that's got to be, surely, for activists here, the major project ahead of us in the next 4 or 5 years, while we have to endure this this government. And part of that absolutely is about, and I won't go into it in much detail, but absolutely the vaccine apartheid that we've got now at an international level, precisely because governments like the British government have decided our population, the lives of people here, are worth more than the lives of people across the global south, and therefore we will buy up all the vaccines and vaccinate our entire population. And to hell with any idea around international distribution. I'll just mention it because I was so shocked by it, but on Friday we learned that the South African government, which is desperately trying to vaccinate its frontline medical staff, it hasn't vaccinated anyone yet, it is desperately trying to vaccinate its doctors and nurses, has managed to buy some vaccines from AstraZeneca and has ended up having to pay 2.5 times what most European governments are paying for those vaccines. There is no justice in this coronavirus pandemic, but it's up to us to fight for that justice. And I believe that by building on the links we've made tonight, we can do. Just finally to say, look, Trump was the kingpin for this international far-right movement. He gave them so much strength and money and energy. And the fact that we've removed him, you particularly have removed him from office, has created a hole. It's created a crack in their project. And you know, the great Leonard Cohen said, there are cracks in everything. That's how the light gets in, right? And so we've got this light now. Let's use this light to guide us towards the better world that we need to build together as a genuinely internationalist movement. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was, I think, quite concise and gave us an idea of what we're dealing with. I am loving this go, I have to say. Everyone's coming up with quite a hopeful message. And I trust that Shyster, as he's our final speaker, is also going to do that. If I can abuse my chair privilege a little bit and kind of sneak in a question even before you've given us your contribution, Shyster. I read recently, it was an article, a news piece article, and there was a quote by you on behalf of the Stop Trump Coalition, talking about how the protests we organized were basically the most diverse protests you've ever seen and ever attended, which I share that assessment. I think that's very much true. If you can, either within what you're going to say or towards the end, just give us, if you can, some idea of how we can continue bringing these people along with us to the upcoming protests, to the struggles ahead now that Trump is gone. I think that's our challenge, isn't it?
It is. So hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever everyone is. Thank you so much for organising this meeting. I think it's really important, and it's been a real honour to hear our speakers. And everything you said, I fully endorse and echo. And I think I'll start with this idea of hope. We have to be hopeful, and this is a moment of hope. And I think it's absolutely fundamental that we acknowledge this and amplify the hope. So Trump has left office. Trumpism definitely has not left our global political system, as we know. I think it's really important to say that, you know, as one of the proud founding members of Stop Trump, along with my colleagues here and others who aren't here as well, you know, we want to be really clear to echo what Dindy said, what Paul has said. This has come about due to the blood, sweat and tears of American people, especially Black women, women of color, Muslims, Jews, members of the LGBTQI community, trans people, immigrants, refugees. These are the people who have been targeted specifically by the Trump regime, and they have suffered greatly. And the suffering has continued from previous you know, presidents as well, and what they've delivered or not delivered to the people of the United States. So we should make it very, very clear. This is what this hope and this moment has been based on. It's been based on a lot of pain, a lot of misery. We cannot forget that 400,000 Americans have died due to this pandemic alone. This is an absolutely devastating number of people, and we're far from, you know, over. The COVID pandemic is far from over. So we just want to take a moment to really salute everybody involved in removing Trump from the White House, as we say. And as the Stop Trump Coalition is known, this was never about our campaign and our movement. It's never about one man. Of course, Trump is a grotesque symbol and a caricature, just like Johnson is and Bolsonaro is, of these so-called strong men and the politics that they endorse and that they carry out. But it was never about a one man for the Stop Trump Coalition. So just to go back a little bit, in 2018, we organised an historical protest in London, which we're really proud of. 250,000 people poured into the streets of central London. On a weekday. That's the largest ever number of people that have gathered in central London for a protest during a weekday. Now, when we were organising that protest, we were mocked. We were called all sorts of things by the mainstream media in this country. We were told that we were we were not patriotic enough to Britain. We were damaging the country's prospects of getting a good Brexit trade deal, etc., etc., etc. Members of our movement were criticised in national newspapers. I was compared to an ISIS supporter based on my identity, and it went on and went on. These attacks were done in mainstream newspapers, and you know, there were attacks carried out by the billionaire media in this country. So we can't forget this. We also were disgusted to see that Britain chose to stand in full solidarity with Trump. It was one of the main governments in the world that unapologetically stood with Trump. Now, Britain's got a good track record of standing unapologetically with regimes over many years, including South Africa. So we've got good history in this country about this, but we've equally got incredibly powerful people's history that's pushed back on all of this. And we are known around the world for showing solidarity, for being internationalists, and for standing our ground when it's needed. Now, one of the most brilliant aspects of our protest was that those images beamed around the world, and we had so many people from across the United States contacting us, feeling very emotional, saying that they, you know, that they really felt that solidarity, and it damaged Trump. It damaged Trump deeply. You know, for a narcissist such as Trump, this was a devastating reality. Some people here have made a reference to the baby Trump blimp on the sidebar as well. Now, I mean, that to me just really epitomizes what the protest was about. You know, this is British humor at its best. We're very good at making fun of ourselves and everyone else. And I think that was such a beautiful symbol of the protest, and that blimp is now in the Museum of London, and so we're very pleased that it's there, and it was an honor to work with everybody involved with that as well. And the kind of pushback that we had to the blimp as well was quite incredible. Just a group of deeply narcissistic individuals, mostly men, it has to be said, so triggered and so troubled by this. And I'll wrap up my point about the protest just by saying that when the blimp was being inflated, I was asked by the activists involved in creating Trump Baby to act as a spokesperson. And I've never seen so many journalists in my entire life from around the world gathered in Parliament Square to see that blimp being inflated. And as Baby Trump was being inflated, Trump's motorcade was going past. And then he had the audacity to say, oh, I didn't see it go up. He did see it go up. So, you know, well done to everybody who came out. That was one of the most diverse protests we've seen. There were steel workers from the north of England who spent hours traveling down to London. I met first-time mothers on the first-time protest with their children. And you know what was really, really powerful is as we started building this protest, it took a life of its own. As I said, we came under sustained attack, okay? But when Trump started caging children on the Mexican border, everything changed. This protest took a life of its own. People started building it themselves around the country. There were individual protests taking place across the country. The UK map was littered with protests. We had a lot of right-wing journalists interviewing us on radio and other broadcast media. They just opened the microphone and say, what do you want to say? Because it got to the point where they couldn't defend this anymore. And that's what we're seeing now since Trump has left office. The same journalists, the same powerful men, the same business, the corporates who enabled him and everything he represents are now walking away so fast from him. And we know this happens throughout history, okay? The hypocrisy is rank, but we give witness to this, right? So I think what we need to do now in terms of, what happens from this moment onwards, well, first of all, I think it's essential we maintain hope. I do not think that Biden is going to solve all of the United States of America's problems. Neither is Kamala Harris. There's no denying this. But I'm also not part of that group of people who just want to go around being negative and criticizing everything and tearing everything down, okay? We need to find ways to amplify the changes that are taking place, and we need to urgently get behind those changes, as our colleagues have said, and we need to continue to push this administration to do better than it already possibly might be planning to do in pockets, okay? The other thing we need to do is we need to reverse the politics of negativity and envy in the left itself. This is part of the problem. We need to have a bolder, more visionary idea of where we are going, not just country by country, but as a collective. And one of the things that we need to do, and I've been seeing this so much for most of my life, and especially last year when the Black Lives Matter movement was reinvigorated, and Dindy and I have been speaking about this privately as well. The politics of tearing each other down, the politics of who gets to speak for people. This is useless. It's not going to get us anywhere. What we have to do is we have to unite around a vision of what we want to see, how we want to live, and what we believe this world should be about. And we may not all agree with that vision in terms of the approach and how we get there, but that really is irrelevant, because at the same time, we have to start doing that work. We have to start building that movement. United we stand and divided we fall. It's as simple as that, okay? I'm the grandchild of colonized subjects. I'm British through and through. I mean, I know what Britain did around the world, and they partly did it by dividing people who had nothing, who were on their knees, and we're seeing the same thing here. So what we need to do is we need to learn, as Ndindy's already said, from the rest of the world in terms of the community organizing, the community building. Look at the feminists in Argentina and what they managed to do with abortion laws. Look at the feminists in Pakistan, what they're doing daily. Look at, the people, the most marginalized people in the world find ways to come together and to stand up for each other and each other's humanity. And right now, the most important thing that we need to do is keep each other alive. And I don't say this in I don't say this without understanding what that means in relation specifically to COVID-19. We have 100,000 people who have died in the United Kingdom. We have 400,000 people who have died in the United States of America. We have hundreds and thousands of people who have died across the globe and are dying. And they will continue dying unless we force change. And I believe that change is coming. And we also need accountability for all these politicians, for these pharmaceutical companies. Everything you said, Nick, I fully echo there. We have to force this change, okay? I'm from Oxford. I'm born and raised in a city that's given the world this vaccination. I'm very proud of the fact that those scientists have said, we want to develop a vaccination for everyone. We do not want to make profit from this vaccination. This government had to listen to them. So we need to start supporting these movements, and we need to connect the dots. And I've said this over and over again, this idea of working in silos, it doesn't work for anyone, okay? We have to stand up for all of humanity, and we have to learn how to do that. Otherwise, none of us are going to win, really, and we're not going to get anywhere. I think in the UK, the things that are giving me hope at the moment are the people. It's not the government, it's not this government in particular, which is an utter disgrace. But if we look at what's happening right now in the United Kingdom, we have the UK students on strike. They've been going on strike. They've literally been barricaded in to their halls of residence while there's a pandemic raging, and they're terrified, and they have defied the university authorities in cities like Manchester, demanded that their rent is returned, and they've won, okay? We have food delivery drivers on strike. We have British gas workers on strike. We have, a couple of weeks ago, some of the UK's teaching unions organised a Zoom meeting. They had 400,000 people attend their Zoom meeting. This is absolutely incredible and powerful. And we must hold on to these things when we are feeling rightly exhausted, despondent, overwhelmed, and our mental health is under assault because of everything that's going on. This is where the change is coming from. This is where the hope is coming from. Now, because we are in a pandemic, we don't necessarily see this unity. We don't see this. These images are not being beamed onto our news bulletins. We're not hearing about it, but it's still happening. And we need to understand that it's happening, and we need to support these workers. So there's a lot of things that are already happening. I agree with my colleagues that this is a moment for hope. It's also a moment of great devastation, as I said. So what we need to do is we need to stand firm. I think that the UK has a lot to learn from the US in terms of your organising, the Cori Bushs of the world, the Stacey Abrams of the world. In this country, we're just busy tearing each other down. The left, quite frankly, is not functioning properly. Has it ever? Who knows? Okay, but right now in the UK, the left is really, it's not a great place, quite frankly. It's not a safe place for a lot of people, especially minoritized people, and this is something we also need to change. There's somebody here, Jane's putting something about disability justice. I fully agree with you, Jane. This is not a one or the other. We have to stand up for everyone. We have to look at who is the most vulnerable and who is being the most targeted, and we need to stand in solidarity, and we need to build politics that are intersectional and in the truest sense of the word, and that understand that unless we are trying to improve the lives of the most vulnerable, we're not doing our job properly. So I'll just wrap up by saying that I'm someone who has been an activist my whole life, as many of us here in this meeting are, and I'm going to be honest with you and say I've been absolutely exhausted. My mental health has been really drained in the past few months. Last week, there was a moment where 10 of my friends reached out to me in 72 hours. I was getting news of people in their lives who died to COVID, including people under the age of 40. There are people on this call who have a similar situation. So, solidarity to you. So my point here is, it's going to be harder than ever for us to organize, given these circumstances. It's harder than ever for us to literally get out of bed in the morning and keep going. But we've got to find ways to do it. And we're only going to do that by standing with each other and being vocal and visible and unapologetic in what our beliefs are, and not shying away from what our beliefs are. It's a tragic situation that the left, I don't believe the left has to be one uniformed and united voice. because that would mean it wouldn't have any politics, and that would be ridiculous as well, okay? But it doesn't have to be what it is at the moment. We do have to find ways to come together. Getting Trump out was a #1 priority for Americans. They got him out. I mean, he clung on for dear life, and he's still there, as we know. And the worrying aspect now is, and this is what we have to watch out for, Trump is crass, brash, and a loud, disgusting caricature of a man, okay? Next time, the guy who comes in, and it will be a guy, will be slick, sophisticated. He will come in a suit like Trump did, but he will speak like, he means business. This is what we're going to be dealing with. When I was watching that inauguration, I saw this fanboying of George W. Bush, and I almost had a moment where I was like, oh yeah, that was George W. Bush, right? The man who started the new round of warfare in the Middle East, and here he is being welcomed like some kind of nice, cuddly man. But you know what? For a moment, I did actually think, oh yeah, those were the good old days. Well, they weren't the good old days, right? We haven't had any good days for a long time. So we've got to be careful about this. We've got to understand that these individuals like Trump are very easy to mobilize around. But what about the rest of them? As Nick says, what about the network of contacts and networks and financial wheeling, dealing going on in the background, the Bannons of the world, all these types of people? So we do have a window of opportunity. I do feel hopeful, but I fully understand that people are absolutely exhausted and dealing with mass trauma in ways some people have not dealt with before. Sadly, for Black people, for Indigenous people, for minoritized people, trauma is part of our daily life and it runs through our DNA. But for others, it's not the same. So what we have to do is we've got a campaign to win. This is the final point I'm going to make. We've got a campaign to win. We do have to come together. I agree with you, Paula, what you said about the squad. Thank goodness for the squad. Where is the UK squad? I don't see it, okay? So we need to start believing that we are going to win, and it will take maybe another generation, but we don't have any choice. We just got to crack on and do the work. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Shaista, and everyone as well. Amazing contributions. I'm also really pleased that as you guys are speaking, questions are coming in, people are answering questions in the Q&A little function here on Zoom. For those in the audience that are not familiar with it, you can see next to the participants, there's a little kind of icon for Q&A, and you can see the questions that some have asked and some have answered. We have about 15 minutes left of this call, so all of my bragging about how I'm going to keep it to time is out the window. But there we go. No one's insights were less important than sticking to the plan. So I think we've had a good selection of points of view, but there are a few of these questions that kind of repeat themes that I would like to throw back at you and hear your thoughts. A lot of people are asking about Trump supporters, so-called Trump cult members. Are you, especially for the comrades in the States, are you worried about imminent retaliation from these groups, about even more violence, even more aggression, especially towards minorities? And also, is there a way of winning people over? Should we be trying to win these people over? What wins them over? And what kind of deals with the conspiracies behind some of these groups? Because for some of them it's conspiracy, for others it's just white supremacy. We all know that. And then there are a few points as well that I think are very relevant for us here in the UK that I would like to hear Nick and Shaista's view on. We talk about so we've talked a lot about organizing internationally. Where are the kind of the examples? What are the practical steps that we need to be taking now beyond just recognizing the need for that? And also, this is a good question that I do want you guys to think about. There seems to be a reclaimed idea of patriotism and freedom coming through kind of Biden's inauguration, what the flag represented there. is this something that the left in the UK should be trying to do, and how? So I'm gonna go back to the order of speakers we had. So Dindy, if you can kind of reflect on what's happening with Trump supporters. Should we really be fighting to kind of incorporate these people back into a movement of working people, say?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a really important question. And I will start by saying that for whatever reason, there's this pervasive narrative that the Trump supporters are poor, dispossessed white people with economic anxiety. It turns out these are mostly petty bourgeois folks, folks who own franchises and boats and small business owners. And so I think for one, that needs to be understood and elevated. And 74 million people voted for this person. They're certainly not all white nationalists or white supremacists. This is true. They're certainly not all captured by QAnon conspiracies. This is absolutely true. And so, yes, I do think there's a contingent of people who, you know, just kind of got caught up because they are conservatives and haven't really figured out what it was. And once the Republican Party got hijacked, they went with the flow. And so I do think that, in fact, if their material lives improve, that's where the promise lies, right? Like, if we have to be the people who have answers, we have to be the people of yes to something, not just what we don't want. And I think maybe that's where we have struggles. And I don't think it's our fault. I mean, like, I inhaled plumes of tear gas this summer, crisis after crisis, Muslim ban, like this Trump thing, day after day is just something that needed to be resisted and fought, like, right? Like that's what has taken up the energy. And so I think having this Biden presidency for what it is, and we understand what it is, at least gives us an opportunity, you know, even if it is a sham of a democracy, if it doesn't offer what we want, we can breathe and think together, and you know, maybe we can come back to like understanding truth and facts together. There's certain things that there's potential there. I do want to also talk a little bit about what Shaista talked about, which I haven't emphasized yet, which is the role of trauma for folks of color and people in general. And I think this is something on the left we do have to take seriously, that's a thing. So hate crimes have gone up in the last 4 years. Actually, anti-Chinese or anti-Asian hate in this country is at an all-time high. Every time we take surveys, I work with young people, with kids. Year after year after year, even the FBI, who, you know, for what it is, even they are really saying, right, there's a rise in this kind of right-wing terror and violence. And so we are actually afraid of losing our lives. We are actually really afraid. And I don't want to emphasize this point in a panel of this kind, but I also do need to be quite honest that I live in Los Angeles, and I do now see Confederate flags. Like that's normalized. That's unusual to me, and that's strange to me, right? There's an actual fear. We're counter-protested all the time by right-wing people, and they show up with guns, and they show up, you know, so it's not just people dunking on each other on the internet or hateful rhetoric. There's actual palpable fear. And so hopefully with this turn, we can move from that. But I do want to say that's also taking up some of the energy, and that healing from that is important as part of our work.
No, thank you very much for raising that, Ndingi. And I think as much as we need to be hearing this and recognizing this and kind of being very much aware that while for some of us, our privilege means that what we're dealing with is mostly online hate and bad language, people are actually dealing with threats to their life every single day, every time they make a statement. every time they are outside just by being who they are. So absolute solidarity to you, and we're so inspired by what you've been doing all summer, and you must be so exhausted, but thank you. Thanks, Ndindi. Paul, do you want to come back to some of these points and also some of the questions you've been answering as well on the Q&A thing?
Okay, sure. I have trouble topping Ndindi on this. I mean, my brother, I have a brother. I have two brothers. One lives with me, and he sort of has the same idea as I do. But my slightly younger brother lives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and he's a Trump supporter. He got, inoculated with the virus through Ross Limbaugh's radio shows, and he's very consistent. I cannot talk to him about politics. I don't know how. He lives in a different universe. His directly addressing that is, to me, basically not something I can do or want to do. But the Democrats and the left, because they're not all that different in this respect, have neglected small towns and rural areas generally in the United States. With neoliberalism and Bill Clinton, they formally started grabbing up these trade deals, which were really the wet dream of capitalists. And that's why it's so important to fight the new U.S.-British proposed trade deal. A lot of workers that I knew in my union work in Western Pennsylvania, which went from 2/3 Democratic to 2/3 Republican in 20 years, because they felt abandoned by the Democratic Party and by the unions. And there's just a general feeling, and I'm not saying you're right about the virulent neo-Nazis are mainly not working class people. They're small business or they're what we used to call, the scum. I mean, they really are. I mean, the deplorables. They're people that have lost their moorings. But I think society-wide, I think that whatever this program that comes out of the Democratic Party, which can be somewhat influenced by the left, it's got to look at the material and psychological needs of people who do not live in big cities. I think there's a good approach in that Biden's nomination for Secretary of the Interior is Deb Haaglund, is a Native American. And I think she has she went to Standing Rock, and she's very sensitive on the rights of Indigenous Americans and on climate. But that's one appointment out of many. I think if I had something more to say to Sanders, I think despite the fact he comes from rural Vermont and built a political base in a non-metropolitan area, he doesn't really talk about the needs of farmers and small town and rural residents as much as he could in his recovery program. I think, for example, I'll say one more thing. I think rebuilding the whole community health clinic system, which Sanders fought for, and it's what he got by giving a vote for Obamacare. That was a really good move, and I think that system has been that system, which is absolutely essential to protect rural people in public health, has to be strengthened and rebuilt. And just as we have to look at it, I think a jobs program that really, really gives millions of people jobs and in turn and apprenticeships to be trained for those jobs is absolutely core to both emerging from the pandemic, reducing economic inequality, reducing some of this political tension, and in the long run addressing planetary survival.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think really kind of poignant points and things that we in the UK should also bear in mind in terms of how we kind of divide communities, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly, just when we talk about services, but we never talk about who actually has access to services, what the infrastructure is like to begin with, for some of these communities that we, paint this red wall or whatever it may be. We have our own terminology about people that we project various ideas onto in the left. I would like to go back to Nick now. Honestly, there's been so many kind of points coming through even in the meantime. But final remarks, Nick.
Yeah, well, I'll try and answer the two questions you gave me, Alina. So first of all, on kind of flag and family and these kind of right-wing concepts. And I mean, I'm skeptical. I mean, Keir Starmer's doing it here, like, on steroids, right? And I'm skeptical about the extent we can reclaim those concepts. I mean, growing up gay in the 80s, I know what family meant, and it wasn't about me, that's for sure. And working with groups around the world in the global South, I know what British patriotism has meant to them, and it's not good. So, having said that, I absolutely think the left is very bad on creating concepts of belonging, of community, and of pride. And we need those things badly, right? So I've got some ideas on it, but I can't claim I've got the answer to how we do that. But I think as the left, we need to think about that. The one thing I do think we should reclaim is the idea of liberty and freedom. I mean, those concepts came from the French Revolution and to some degree the English Revolution, and it makes my blood boil that today the alt-right uses these concepts to be, you can kind of shit on who you want anywhere in the world, and that's my freedom and my, liberty. Like, that is just, so I don't think we should be scared of those concepts, and I think we should show them for what we believe in freedom for everybody in the world. Your second question about internationalism, I think there is hope here. Sometimes I think we're a little bit scared of the public. I know I am, but sometimes you're pleasantly surprised. So working on vaccines over the last few months has given me, actually, I've been surprised, right? I thought people would want vaccines here first, and to hell with everybody else. I want it, for my own community and my own family, and I haven't got time to think about other people. I'm astonished how much support our campaign for fair distribution of vaccines and patent-free vaccines has got. I'm astonished how much it's in the newspapers, even now when people are struggling so much in our own society and are losing loved ones and going through terrible trauma. I'm amazed how much people are still, we're still getting such positive, even in the mainstream media, such positive takes on these stories. So that gives me a little bit of hope that actually, and I think, you can look at the same when it comes to climate. And I'll just finish by saying, look, my organization is all about trying to build these links, and, sometimes we do well and sometimes not. But I definitely remember that moment in the 90s very clearly. It's so important to me, where a bunch of incredibly poor peasants in the south of Mexico did something, took over their country essentially, and took over autonomous regions, the Zapatista movement, and gave birth to the anti-globalization movement, which was just so formative for me, and was just enabled us within a few years to challenge institutions that people hadn't even heard about a few years before. The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the G7, G8, they couldn't meet anywhere in the world without being besieged by protesters. It was an incredible moment, and it was so, it must be the biggest, most internationalist, most diverse movement that's ever existed. And it kind of came like that, and we didn't see it coming. We were just doing our work, and it was suddenly there, and we were part of it. And so that gives me a lot of hope as well. But I do think we need to start learning from the structures we had at the time, the World Social Forums and whatnot, and really think about how we can have these conversations on an international level again, because for sure at the moment they're happening very sporadically and they're not touching most people. So that's a challenge for us and a task for us.
Thanks very much, Nick. Yes, it's good to remind ourselves of the moments when actually things worked, and we got the platform and we got the exposure. And once you do that, you actually do capture a lot of people's attention, and people agree with you. Because why wouldn't they? Because what we're saying makes sense. Actually, I think we need to get back to believing that what we're saying really makes sense for the lives of most people. Shaista, over to you for final remarks.
Alina. So I'm just going to start off with Grenfell. So tail end of last year, a US journalist interviewed me for National Public Radio, and they said to me, have you seen anything similar to the growing death toll of people in this country to COVID in relation to who they are, what they look like, disproportionately working class people of color? And I said, yes. I said, those images that flashed up and that were on the front pages of our newspaper reminded me of Grenfell. And this journalist took a really deep intake of breath. He was like, oh. And I said, it looks to me like, you know, when the first front pages about Grenfell were issued, you saw like a whole load of headshots of people, and they all looked black, brown, immigrants, marginalized people. And so I start there because we have to start connecting what's going on. We have to understand that one catastrophe almost always leads to another one and another one and another one. And it doesn't happen by accident. It's not by accident that the most marginalized people whose humanity is not a given, is not automatically, you know, people are not given the right to be human, okay? They have to prove they're human. It's not by accident that they're the first victims in every situation. So that's where we need to start. We need to reclaim human rights. Human rights is not a dirty word, despite what the British state says and what it's been doing around the world for hundreds of years, and all the other countries as well. The fact of the matter is we've got to reclaim human rights. We've got to reclaim this word dignity and belonging. You can only belong if you are treated as a human being, if you are valued, if you are loved, and if you are cherished. And these might just seem like nice words that I'm throwing out, but they're not nice words. These are fundamental human rights. So I think one of the most powerful things that's been going on in this country, in particular since 10 plus years of austerity and devastation, is the community organizing in neighborhoods, in local areas, where it's the people who are coming together, the mutual aid groups and everything that's popped up, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic started. Now, they're not going to go away because the need is not going to go away. Now, I'm not advocating for everyone to start running food banks, because it's not right for everyone to be running food banks. The state should, you know, there's enough wealth and enough money, and there should be a functioning welfare state. So that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, sometimes when we're looking at the huge level of mayhem, for want of a better word, that's going on in the world, it's really hard to understand, where do I start? So I think the place to start is local, and the national, the local, the national, and the international is interconnected. It always has been, and it always will be. So this term internationalism doesn't mean much to many people who are struggling and those who are benefiting from the crisis upon crisis that's been created. So I think that's what we have to do. We have to always go back to the roots of communities and human, you know, where humans live and where they want to thrive. And that is that everything is connected. We don't have this level of poverty and inequity in the UK and around the world for no reason, right? If you just look at the numbers of wars and the failed foreign policy and everything that's been particularly accelerated over the last 10 years and the war on terror, you know, how much money is that, you know, money's been thrown at that. So I think that's what we need to do. We need to start listening to people. And the final thing I'm going to say is we need compassion, okay? So we as the left are very good at pointing fingers at the right, when, you know, the far right, that's what many of them are. But what about us? What are we doing, okay? We need to listen to people. I'm so sick of going into meeting after meeting, knocking on doors, having other activists lecture people, telling them who's going to change their life. You know, oh, here's another old white man, you know, let's get him in as a leader. He's going to change your life. It's ridiculous. We need to start listening, and we need to start challenging ourselves, and we've got to take ourselves out of the echo chambers, and we've got to start doing the work, because people know what they need, and they also are willing to work with each other, okay? We know, fundamentally, we know what we need to do as human beings. And I think that's where we need to start from.
I think that's a wonderful point to end on. We're all human. We all know what needs to be done, and we all know what will make our lives better. And as long as we have a convincing and powerful idea to bring people along with, to work towards, then this generation or the next, but we'll get there. The future will be ours. I think we can all agree on that, and I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm very pleased that I got the chance to chat to you all, that we had wonderful contributions from our speakers. Many thanks to all of you for giving up your Saturday morning or Saturday lunchtime or Saturday evening. It's not going to be the last time you hear from us. I'm sure we'll keep in touch. Any links and information that has been posted on the chat will be circulated as well to people who have attended. There will be a recording of this session that will come out on the Another Europe is Possible YouTube channel. So that will be in a couple of days. You'll be able to forward that to friends or family, or just rewatch for those moments where you got a bit distracted. But thank you very much for your time, and I will see you all soon. Solidarity. Bye, everyone.